Roads, taverns, and mills, the cornerstones of a community. Roads connect people to places. Taverns connect people to each other. Mills connect people to an economy. Together, they build a community.
Actually, all three are interrelated because they deal with land ownership. That's a common bond among those three. The initial motivator for a road would be for it to be an artery of commerce. However, the social aspect was very, very close behind. Not only a focal point of the local economy, but also at least a social gathering place for the leaders, for the men of the community. That was where they would run into each other. That and taverns is where they would run into each other and discuss issues involving the county or even things beyond. But it all began with roads. In fact, it all began with basically game trails.
Of course, churches are another vital component to a community. But that's a story in and of itself, a story to be told later. Historically, the most important element in this equation is the road. Roads were not just the paths down which we walk or ride or transport goods. In the 18th and 19th century, they were the avenues of communication. They were the telephone, the postal route, the internet, all rolled up into one. Without them, we would have all been hermits. With them, we became a community. Roads. As we hurtle along today at 55 miles per hour, we take them for granted. But whoa, let's slow down. Look more closely. Once your eye gets used to them, old roadbeds can be seen everywhere. You can pick them out running parallel to today's highways, or crisscrossing the countryside as sunken traces lined by trees and brush.
So this is the old road that crossed from Orange County to across the river.
Between the washing away of earth from storms and the blowing away of earth as dust, roads would tend to start sinking into the ground.
We learn about early roads from Ann Miller. She's an historian with the Virginia Transportation Research Council. She tells us that the very first roads were made by large, now extinct animals, dating back as far as the last major ice age.
By the time that the settlers came, we certainly were way past the massive game. The big sloths and the mastodons and so forth were all gone for thousands of years. But certainly there is evidence, probably bison, elk, fairly large game animals that would go in herds.
Basically, you had animal trails that Native Americans had begun to also use. Usually, you wanted to find animal trails because the animals would find the easiest slopes. The animals would find the best river and all kinds of crossings. The animals would find the easiest way to get through, and then you follow those. I like the one that people talk about. If you buy a piece of property and you've got a piece of high ground that you want to build your house on, the best thing to do is get yourself some cows and feed them up on the high ground, and then see where they walk to get down to the river or to the stream or wherever you're going to cross. See how they make it back and forth, and they will tell you where the road needs to go.
Naturally, Native Americans followed the game, as did hunting parties of European settlers.
And this so-called Great Iroquois War Trail went down the eastern face of the Blue Ridge. And it was not necessarily a single trail. Very much like what they call the Carolina Road. Actually, the Carolina Road was a number of disparate trails that would come together, usually at good river crossings, and then fan out again.
Of course, the first roads for European settlers were the rivers.
And the Rappahannock River was navigable by ocean-going ships all the way to the first set of rapids, what they call the falls of the Rappahannock. And that's that set of rapids that is northwest side of Fredericksburg. You could sail an ocean-going ship all the way up to those rapids.
So why were they going west? Simple answer: to find land.
Of course, the earliest road through here, formal road, was the road that was cleared to Germanna in 1714 to allow the settlement. When you first have settlement coming into, particularly into the Piedmont in Virginia, each county had at least one mountain road that was heading to the Blue Ridge that would get people into the backcountry for settlement. Here what you're seeing is, in the vicinity of Orange, the corridors of the three mountain roads, of course, coming in from Essex, and below that King and Queen, King William, all coming together close to the modern town of Orange, and then proceeding on to the west, cutting off onto Montford, through present-day Liberty Mills, and then going down the Scuffletown Road, and eventually, of course, towards Lydia and towards Swift Run Gap. Those three mountain roads for Essex, King and Queen, and King William are still partly visible in trace, and in some cases are partly overlaid by modern roads. They come together near the town of Orange, and from there, one Spotsylvania Mountain Road goes west. That is more or less in the corridor of the present Scuffletown Road, 609. And a lot of that is probably very close to the route that Spotswood took in 1716 to get over the Blue Ridge.
And what about the road that the Marquis de Lafayette used in 1781 when he came through on his way to Yorktown?
The road that the Marquis built was more of the road that he improved to some extent. Originally, the Marquis roads wiggled through here, and then, of course, came through here and crossed at Brock's Bridge. What he did was he did some quick improvements to the road, probably some quick clearing, and might have thrown down some trees for corduroy to get the troops through there. You also have north-south roads that tend to be called Carolina roads, or sometimes Caroline roads. We have, of course, right outside this door, we have Caroline Street, which is the remnant of one of those north-south roads.
From the deep water docks at Fredericksburg, there was a road that went all the way across Spotsylvania County, all the way across Orange County, and all the way through Albemarle County to the docks at Scott's Landing on the James River, Scottsville. That was the major development road at one time.
Now you may wonder why all these roads converged where the town of Orange is located today.
There is a pass through the Southwest Mountains where this little settlement began. In other words, you could have roads from north-south, east-west coming to this pass. That's to get through. And that's Orange developed along that pass. And in fact, if you want to see the pass, you go into the main part of town and you go to the railroad station. And if you're standing at the railroad station looking at the railroad tracks, you look to your right and the land rises. You look to your left and the land rises. And right where you're standing is the pass.
And so it was only natural for private homes to offer a roof, a bed, and a meal to travelers.
People who had come up here ahead and built cabins and some structures found themselves with people knocking on their doors, wanting to come in out of the weather, wanting to spend the night, maybe wanting to stay there, spend nights there for a few days while they looked around.
And as travelers increased, these private B&Bs became businesses. Typically, taverns sprang up where roads crossed.
Taverns were serving the public need. So if you have a busy road that's being traveled, then you're going to find a tavern or an ordinary so many miles apart. I like to say people are riding on horseback or carriage and maybe they can do 20 miles or 25 miles, something like that. So you're going to find them spaced along to serve those needs, and people are going to need a place to eat, to overnight, and also to have their horses and carriage serviced. Horses need water to be fed and that type of thing. So that was all part of any tavern, no matter where it is.
We know that at least 2 taverns were in operation. Bell's Tavern and Timothy Crosswaite's Tavern very early on, and there were probably more than that.
In fact, when the courthouse was moved from its Raccoon Ford site to today's town of Orange in 1749, the first court sessions were actually held in Timothy Crosswaite's Tavern.
You would always find them adjacent to a courthouse. And here again, you have court day once a month, and people are traveling long distances for court day, and they need a place to rest overnight, have their horses cared for, food, beverage, that type of thing. And a lot of people came for court day, not just for court, but it was a social event in the community. And so the courthouse green was turned into almost like a festival.
In particular, the March court session was a busy time, with planters bringing their mares to be bred to stallions, payment for which would be agreed upon over a tankard at the tavern. Another busy time would be Election Day, where candidates would treat the voters to large quantities of alcohol. During colonial times and well into the 19th century, these taverns were pretty rough places.
Now, if you wanted to spend the night, you would go upstairs, or, then if you're a gentleman, you pay the money, you'd probably be sleeping a few more bed.
So imagine a room with multiple beds in it, and you're not renting the room, you're not renting the bed, you're basically getting space in that bed. And so, and here's another concept that's difficult for people to understand. You go to bed and you wake up in a little while because somebody's getting in the bed with you, and so in the next morning you're meeting people you didn't know.
You don't take your clothes off. You can inherit somebody's fleas and lice. I don't know when taverns began to offer such amenities as baths, but I do know that at one time at the Rising Sun Tavern in Fredericksburg, when in the evening, travelers had come and were starting to settle in, if a gentleman wanted a bath, it was arranged, and these were the kind of tubs that you actually sat in, and he could get himself a bath. And the difference was, if a lady wanted a bath, she got fresh water.
When we see the word tavern, we automatically think of drinking, and yes, there was a lot of that. Much more than today.
In the 18th century, you would have had probably some rum mixed with a lot of fruit in a big bowl and making a punch. As time went on, different liquors became more popular. Different styles of beer became more popular. Ales, for example. You would also have ciders, because you had all kinds of fruits in which you could turn into different ciders. Well, anytime you have alcohol involved, you're probably going to have some fights and some rough characters. We don't have any documentation here at our tavern of ever having prostitution or really terrible breakouts of fighting or whatever, but I'm sure it happened.
And then there were games and gambling.
Obviously, all sorts of different card games, bowling games. We just saw an example of upstairs of one called Shut the Box, which was new to me. Again, a game of chance.
Back in the day, they did a lot of gambling, and in fact, here at Hanover Tavern, we knew that Mr. Twyman kept a billiards table. And although it was against the law to gamble, the sheriff did arrest somebody here for gaming.
It says other indoor games included shooting at random indoor targets.
You know, gambling was such a big part of life at that day. And here in Virginia, horse racing was very, very popular. And anytime there was court day, you're going to have horse racing and gambling on the horse race. And I just remember reading an account at a courthouse east of here, might have been the late 19th century, early 20th century, but they actually stopped court and actually came out so they could see the racehorses go by so they could check on their bets.
But the taverns weren't just about drinking, fighting, and gambling. They filled a vital need.
They become 18th century, early 19th century truck stops in terms of all the conveniences and services they provide.
Take a hotel and take a service station that works on your car and take Starbucks and a restaurant and roll them all into one, and that's what a tavern was for the day. A tavern had lots of service buildings to do the domestic needs of running a tavern, a separate building for kitchen, a smokehouse, an ice house, servants' quarters, all of that related to just running the tavern itself. But then you've got barns and stables and blacksmith shop and leather and iron and all that kind of stuff that you might need to make repairs to a carriage or a wagon, or to take care of the horses and mules overnight, feed them, that kind of thing. So it served a lot of purpose.
And in fact, when a tavern was really going full bore, like in the spring when supplies are being brought in, maybe in the fall of the year when harvested crops are being sent down to Fredericksburg to be put on the ships, and these taverns were all going full bore. A tavern site would moo, it would crow, it would bellow, it would whinny, it would be smoky, it would be pretty dirty, it would stink, and to the tavern keeper that all meant money.
In the 18th and 19th century, it took longer to go places. If you were on horseback, a day's travel would be maybe 20 miles. If you were on foot, it was half that, or less. So taverns were located about every 9 miles apart, which is the distance someone can comfortably travel in a day, driving a flock of geese, for example, to market. So let's take a trip from Orange Courthouse to Fredericksburg. If you're on foot, when darkness fell, you needed a place to spend the night. At Verdiersville, near today's Unionville. The next night you'd be at Robinson's Tavern, today's Locust Grove. The next night you'd be at Wilderness Tavern, near the intersection of today's Routes 3 and 20. The next night you'd spend at Chancellorsville or Dowdall's, and the following night you'd be at Fredericksburg. Each leg of that journey about 9 miles apart. Finally, taverns served a vitally important social function as well.
So a lot of times taverns served as a center part of the community where people could come and post their mail and pick up their mail. And the tavern owner is responsible not only for running his business, but also being the postmaster. And a lot of the taverns were stage stops, so they would carry the mail from one place to another. But I've also heard about travelers just agreeing to take this letter to the next stop and drop it off. Read your history about taverns in Boston and taverns in Williamsburg. You realize leading up to the Revolution that a lot of founding fathers were meeting in taverns discreetly to talk about things related to England and the king, and trying to come up with ideas or plans to break away and so forth. So yeah, they served as a gathering point for that. With people traveling, they would bring news from other places and share it within the tavern. Sometimes they might even bring a newspaper, say from a big city, and so people would have an opportunity to read the news or hear it. And you're seeing such a diverse group of people coming together. They might not be traveling together, but all of a sudden they're at the same place, spending the night, eating a meal in a small room, and all of a sudden everybody in that same place are, becoming friends, so to say, and meeting for the first time. And they might be at different levels within the financial structure, but they're all the same here, so who knows, they might end up in that same bed.
It soon became apparent to settlers that they needed something more substantial than a mere track through the woods.
But you would petition whichever governing body was in operation at the time and say that the demands of commerce or what have you necessitated that usually some sort of existing trail or path be developed into a more usable, more permanent road.
And the justices would look at the petition and they would appoint viewers, people who are familiar with the area, to go out and usually meet with these folks, with the local people who wanted a road, and they would decide what's a good way. They would listen to all the arguments, and they would usually get a path that everybody could live with and agreed with, and they would blaze the way, come back to the court, say that yes, we've been out to view the proposed road, and if nobody came in and had a serious objection and it was felt to be a useful route, then the justices would appoint an overseer or surveyor of the road. It's not the guy with the transit, but it's the fellow who is in charge of overseeing the laboring tithables assigned to his road. Keep in mind that in those days, able-bodied males, white, black, slave, free, they were required to work on the roads for up to 6 days a year. There is a theory that's becoming popular in academia that all this work was done by slaves, and that is not true. Basically, you went out there, you would have, if you had a group of able-bodied male slaves, they could be called out, but also the landowner, potentially the landowner's sons.
And the landowners normally didn't want to do it.
Because
they loved having the road, they just didn't want to give up that labor.
And everybody grumbles and brings their picks and shovel, and usually a couple bottles of liquid of refreshment and a little bit of food. And I've seen a wonderful description that some people would bring their dogs along for a little bit of companionship. And they would grub and cut and hack and get a rough clearing through. Now, keep in mind that a road in those days is not a road as we know it now. It's dirt. Particularly for the 18th century, you have no paved roads. Even water-bound macadam has not been invented yet. So you would clear a route. something that you could get foot traffic, horse traffic, cart traffic, which meant that you cut the stumps down low enough that they wouldn't hit the axles, and wide enough that you could get tobacco hogsheads around.
And so they came to be known as rolling roads, down which wheels would roll.
You would have wagons or carts. Your two-wheeled, what was called frequently a Hanover cart. Lighter equipment, you had the two-wheeled chaise or chairs, riding chairs as they were sometimes called. And of course, for a lot of the year, you walked or you rode a horse because the mud was up to the axles and you really couldn't get much of anything through.
Besides various carriages and wagons, rolling stock included huge barrels known as hogsheads. Barrels in general were the easily maneuverable containers of the time, transporting everything from gunpowder to whiskey to the local money crop, tobacco.
First, of course, harvested, dried, packed into large barrels or hogsheads. So you're talking about very high in the 100 pounds or into 1,000 pounds or so. So you've got a fairly large bunch of tobacco there. What's important is that the tobacco not only reaches the destination, but that it reaches the destination dry. Frequently what they would do, they would rig these barrels with some sort of an axle.
And so they would tow the hogshead down the road to the market. Inevitably, they would run into an obstacle, such as a river.
Fords, of course, are the first way that you crossed a stream. You just found a place that wasn't deep enough to take you away, and you crossed. Sometimes you will, particularly on a more major river, such as the Rapidan, you might have a ferry. You had a ferry at Germanna. You had a ferry, I believe, at Raccoon Ford for a little while because that's where the court eventually set up for Orange County. The very first bridge, probably in the Piedmont, was over Wilderness Run. It was up by 1715. It was probably a very crude bridge. Usually what they would do if they needed a bridge, if you couldn't get a good ford or so in those days, you would put what they called mud sills down. You would get a couple sturdy logs, but you would attach some boards, and that was your bridge. Very crude. Later on, you have wooden trusses. By the time that we've got settlement here, at least in the 18th century, you do have some simple trusses.
Sometimes in the low spots, they put down what was known as corduroy,
where they would literally take whole or split logs and put them down on a boggy area so you could at least get things through. Now, of course, it was rough on a horse, it was rough on a wagon, it was not what most roads were made out of.
If a road got into a situation, maybe the road was sinking, and it got to where it was starting to collect water, you just moved the road.
In the early part of the 19th century, a new kind of road was coming into being, the Turnpike. This was a business venture.
About 1816 to about the time of the Civil War is called in Virginia, as far as road history, the Turnpike era.
And the Swift Run Gap Turnpike was supposed to come up through Orange and go over the Blue Ridge Mountains and allow farmers and merchants in the Blue Ridge Mountains to do business in Fredericksburg.
The turnpikes, these are from much longer areas. You're talking about, for a county road, maybe a couple miles. Turnpike may be going on for multiple dozens or even close to 100 miles or so, at least in theory. And so the idea is get it out, get it built, start getting tolls. It may be instructive to note that the Orange Turnpike was one of the ones that never made a whole lot of money and eventually went bankrupt.
The Orange Turnpike can be seen today, a masterpiece of engineering and a dismal failure as a practical road. Ignoring obstacles, it went dead straight, without taking into account local landowners nor the geography, much to the consternation of the beasts of burden and their owners.
They wanted to show you they could do it, and so they did it. Uphill up cliff, through swamp. Yeah, it definitely did not follow the cows.
A huge improvement came with plank roads.
Of course, you cleared a roadbed, and then you dug parallel trenches in which you lay these big wooden sills, and then you laid cross ties with a space between the cross ties. Then you put earth in the middle for your draft animals that were pulling the wagons, for the draft animals to walk on, and then the wagons rolled on these planks. And when they were brand new, built brand new, they were fabulous. The wagons rolled on the wood part, the animals walked on the earth part, and you moved right along. They could not be maintained.
By the middle of the 19th century, the network of roads had expanded. An enterprising Scotsman named John Loudon McAdam developed a way of paving roads.
What about McAdam is a system that was perfected by the early 19th century. It involves broken stone that is graded, and then they would put the stone down in layers, larger stuff lower down, and then in several layers getting progressively smaller and smaller and smaller. Then they would roll it, and then eventually the work would be done by, the final work would be done almost by the wagons that were going over it. They would crush things a little more.
Necessity being the mother of invention, the American Civil War served as a catalyst for the improvement of roads to better move men and materiel.
Interestingly enough, you have the Main Street in Orange is done by the early 1860s. We know that they did have some soldiers redoing the plank road.
Still, there were many hazards to overcome, most of them weather-related, in particular mud, snow, and ice. Keep in mind, winters were much colder then than today. Naturally, there were mishaps and accidents, not to mention poor signage.
At a crossroads or a major fork roads, you had to put up a post of direction. In other words, a post about 10 feet high with some boards on it. Sometimes they actually have a little pointing hand, which is actually called an index.
Yeah.
There are story upon story early travelers' accounts of people getting lost and asking directions, and depending on how good the directions were, either finding their way back or getting even more lost.
An amusing travelogue comes to us courtesy of an illustrator whose pen name was Port Crayon. He was persuaded to take his female cousins on a road trip through western and Piedmont Virginia in the early 1850s. Now let's go back 100 years to 1751 and imagine the journey of Nellie Conway Madison from Montpelier all the way to Port Conway on the Rappahannock River.
And she would have gotten a carriage and gotten on that road and gone to Fredericksburg. And at Fredericksburg, there would be an intersection with the post road, the road that the mails traveled on, that would take her right straight down the south bank of the Rappahannock River, and she would be at Port Royal. And at Port Royal, she would get a ferry directly across the river to Port Conway. And she, keep in mind, is Nellie Conway Madison. When she got to Port Conway, she was home.
When you think a woman who is late in pregnancy, and it's late winter, early spring, the roads are muddy, it's probably not an easy journey. Whether she is being carried in some sort of a riding chair, advanced in pregnancy, she's probably not riding side saddle. Of course, women did not ride astride at that point. She might have been riding pillion behind a groom, a slave, whether her husband actually accompanied her or not. If he did, he might have been the rider.
The occasion was to give birth to her first child in the safety of her ancestral home, surrounded by familiar relatives, servants, and trusted midwives. That child was James, the future 4th President of the United States. Grinding grain into flour to make bread. That fundamental process is a cornerstone of civilization, going back to biblical times and before. But as far as the New World was concerned, the water-driven mill came to us from Europe.
Well, in addition to building fences and bringing up cattle and planting fruit trees and clearing some land to plant, it seems that everybody saw a necessity to build a mill. You could have 2 or 3, even 4 or 5 mills on a single stream. Everybody had to have a mill.
There are minimally, during the mid-19th century, minimally 30 to 35 grist mills that were in existence. Not necessarily in operation, but existed within Orange County during that time.
Ray Ezel has been conducting an inventory and condition assessment of mills in Orange County, Virginia.
The majority of these mills were the small water-powered grist mills, which used the typical, water wheel to turn the gearing and the turbine.
Why so many mills? One of the reasons is that in 18th century Piedmont Virginia, there was a fundamental shift in agriculture away from tobacco and to the planting and harvesting of grain.
A mill operates essentially on the premise of using water power and gravity. A suitable stream was dammed up to provide a certain level of impoundment or a head, and then a mill race was excavated by hand to bring the impounded water through the mill race to the wheel, the water wheel. And so the water flowed from the end of the mill race through a wooden sluice for some short distance, which brought the water right to the very top edge of the wheel, and then it would, by gravity, it would turn the wheel, and the wheel was connected and geared in such a way to then operate all the internal components of the mill itself, typically and mainly the grindstones. Millers were only busy during certain times of the year, during harvest time, in the fall. And then maybe if there was a winter wheat crop. Typically when the mill was in operation after harvest, there may be a dozen wagons, stacked up on the road outside waiting their turn to bring their grain in to the mill and have it ground.
Nathan Stalvey is the director of the Burwell Morgan Mill in Clark County, Virginia. Built in the 1780s, this mill is still working to this day.
First thing we do when we come in the morning is we have to grease up the gears. And we have to clean the stones, bleach the stones, make sure everything's clean and ready to go. Once the gears are greased, then we come up here and we put this stone on. So we have to manually bring these stones over, turn them horizontally, and place them onto the bed stone. The top stone is called the runner stone. That's the stone that actually moves. The bed stone is the flat stone that stays stationary. That's what the runner stone runs on top of. So we move that stone over, and that stone weighs about 3,000 pounds. In perspective, 4-door Toyota Camry weighs about 3,000 pounds. So it takes usually about 3 or 4 of us to move the stone over, lower it down onto the bed stone. Then we put all the furniture around it. We've got our hoop, we've got our chair, we've got our shoe, our damsel rod that we all put on. We tie everything up. We control this rope right here, controls the height of the shoe. That adjusts the speed of how the grain comes out of the shoe into the stone to be ground up. So the French burr is one of the strongest stones you can imagine. French burr stone is the preferred millstone for a lot of mills. French burr stone does not crack very easily. It is extremely solid.
If you were to look at the surface of a millstone, there are several sets of these furrows, and they're arranged diagonally around the millstone, and it just so happens that it moves the grain across that stone, and it works.
Once the wheat is ground up, it goes down the chute into a sifter downstairs, and the grain is sifted out. We bag that grain up and put it into 2-pound bags, bring it up here, sell it here at the mill, sell it across the street at Lock Store and other farm markets in the area.
The miller made his money just like anybody else would have made his money. However, one way that was a little different in which the miller got paid was he would take his portion in product.
There are two important people involved in the operation and building of a mill: the miller and the millwright.
So the millwright has to know really a lot about engineering, mechanical engineering, in order to produce the gearing at the appropriate scale, which takes into account the volume of water coming through the mill race, the distance, the speed, the flow. In Piedmont, Virginia, obviously the labor to construct a mill was there was some formula of free and enslaved labor that would have originally built these millscapes, and again I'm talking about from the mill dam to the race to the mill seat to the tail race.
We know from the ledgers that enslaved people did work here at the mill. They also worked with non-enslaved people here at the mill doing stuff like grinding the grain, bagging the grain, loading grains on wagons, even driving the wagons out to Fredericksburg and Alexandria to deliver the grain that was ground here.
This was a highly specialized field. Even the more functionary workers would have had great skill compared to me and you. They would have understood a lot of these concepts about physics and gravity and the flow and volume of water. There was some combination of free and slave labor. However, all of the labor, for the most part, I think, would have been highly skilled. A trade like a miller, which is a real industrial art. It's not like being a cobbler or a wheelwright or some of these other trades. It's, to me at least, being a miller has a little bit more industrial kind of connotation. The art of milling was a closely guarded secret, and that has its roots in Europe, and with how milling kind of evolved over there, and that tradition was carried on in the Americas. One or two helpers, probably sons or nephews, initially, as the miller. It was an apprentice style situation where that knowledge was passed down.
Mills did not just grind grain.
To this point, we've been thinking in terms of what they call a grist mill, and that's a mill that's going to grind grain. But then you had mills that ground limestone for agricultural lime. You also had sumac mills in which you produced tannin for leather. There were all types of, and then of course, saw mills.
And grain did not just become flour or cornmeal. It could be easily converted into whiskey, which was transportable and non-perishable.
The raw grain and whiskey distilling, went hand in hand, because that was the one product that you had to have in order to distill whiskey. Was you had to have corn. Now, if we look at George Washington up at Mount Vernon, his grist mill and his distillery are only a few hundred feet apart. So one of the ways that he could efficiently and cost effectively move his corn product to market was to convert it into whiskey.
Two things threatened mills: fire and flood.
Mills were notorious for catching fire and burning down, just because you had all this, highly combustible, really small particulate, just like a grain silo today. There were two components of that millscape that were especially in peril during floods of a large stream. One is your dam, and then the second problem, of course, is the actual mill seat itself.
Floods just would take everything away. Interestingly enough, of course, Spicer's Mill survived. I guess because of its location, the water would just simply rise up through it and around it, but no current actually went through. On the other hand, further downstream, there was Peyton's Mill. Peyton's Mill was down there on the Rapidan River just below Brampton. And Fannie Page Hume, in her diary, notes, I think it's 1861, that the river came up and swept away everything.
As time went on, more and more mills sprang up with larger facilities on rivers such as the Rapidan.
Willis Ford, Somerville Ford, Rapidan mills there at the bridge at Rapidan. On farther down, of course, there was Germanna Mills, which is on the river. Half a dozen, mills right on the river, which they probably would have been your bigger, more industrial-oriented mills. At the mill, that is the commercial hub of the neighborhood, especially when you're out in the countryside, because there's no other store or there's no other place to find these things.
Mills became harbingers of industrialization. They were the gathering places, the economic magnets that drew stores, distilleries, repair shops, and houses into communities, leading the way from a barter system to a mercantile economy.
And it's because of the mill, typically, that provided the impetus for these little communities to flourish, through their history.
By the middle of the 19th century, a new kind of road had come into being, the railroad. That is beyond the scope of this documentary, but suffice it to say that railroads became the preferred long-distance carriers across the nation.
Eventually, what you did with roads was you use them to get you to not the seaport, but to the nearest railhead. So the roads had gotten into pretty bad shape. This coincides with that interesting new invention called the automobile. So you have automobiles which can barely run on too many roads because the roads are so bad. In 1894, there was a decision of the Virginia Supreme Court. It was a suit that was actually brought by a school teacher from Louisa County who took exception to having to leave his classroom and get out there and do manual labor on the roads for X number of days a year. And he said this is involuntary servitude, and we got rid of that in 1865. And the Supreme Court agreed with him. So all of a sudden the counties have to find ways to keep the roads up. Some counties pass bonds Most counties just kind of sit around saying, anybody want to keep the road up?
Gradually, the state started playing a larger role in the building and maintenance of roads.
And in 1906, 1907, you have the Virginia State Highway Commission set up. Now, they are at that point an advisory group. Fast forward to, you do have a Federal Roads Act that's passed in 1916, which enables the states to take over the major roads. So 1918 in Virginia, we have the advent of the state primary system. And the primary system is something that is needed because, of course, you've got a war coming on, or actually in process. You've got roads that you cannot move trucks and men and materials. Fast forward again to 1932. Of course, we've got a depression on. So what happens is you have the so-called Byrd Act, which was pushed by Harry Flood Byrd when he Sr. when he was governor, to enable, not require, but to enable the state to assume responsibility for the remaining county roads.
And you pretty much know the rest of the story. Roadways became larger, better, longer. Taverns became service stations, motels, restaurants. And the little grist mills fell into ruin, replaced by large industrial facilities. But it is still important to note that these three cornerstones played such a vital role in bringing us together as a community. And so we conclude with a short half-day journey that Philip and James Barber might have made to visit each other in the early 19th century. From Philip's house, Frascati, past as many as 3 mills and a tavern, on his way to James's house in Barbersville.